Having spoken against immorality and urging the believers in Corinth to flee immorality, that is, sexual relationships outside of the context of marriage, he then needs to address what is God's good purpose for marriage, and that indeed it was God's plan for a man and a woman to marry. For some had gone to the other extent, saying that sex in itself is evil, but the scriptures show plainly that this is God's plan, but in the context of marriage. This had been such an issue in the church at Corinth that this was one of several issues that they wrote to Paul asking him for his advice. And in the rest of the book, he will deal with several such issues that they raised with him. And so chapter 7 begins, "Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. But I say this as a concession, not as a commandment, for I wish that all men were even as I myself. But each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner, and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion." My name's Arthur, and I thank you for joining me as we share together Paul's discussion on the important topic of marriage, chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians, dealing with the relationships between men and women, between husband and wife. The subject is taken up because sexual immorality was such a huge problem in the Corinthian society, in Roman society, in idolatrous societies, and still is in Western society. Even when you go back to the ancient artefacts that come from Canaan, you find there's a great focus on sex in the artefacts that have been found. And so there needs to be strong guidance as to how to deal with these things. What was God's plan? Essentially, God's plan from the very beginning was that it's not good for man to be alone. Let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. One for one, a man and his wife, a wife and her husband. God didn't make several wives for Adam, he made just one. While in the Old Testament there are several instances of men having multiple wives, it always leads to strife. Solomon famously had 700 wives, but they turned his heart away from the Lord, and in taking them he was in direct disobedience to the law that God had given through Moses, that the king should not multiply wives, or horses, or gold and silver, which three things he did. To have several concurrent wives is clearly not the pattern, it is not the normal situation, and it was first introduced when Lamech, the great-great-grandson of Cain, took 2 wives, as a sign that he was greater than his ancestor Cain, at least in his own eyes. And the teaching is that the two shall be one flesh. So the application of that Paul brings here is that the husband is to render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to the husband. Marriage is not just a legal contract, it is a very personal one, and sexual relations within marriage are to be exercised. A husband is to render to his wife the affection due to her. and the wife to her husband. Concerning this showing of affection, we have a little story in the life of Isaac. There was a famine in the land, and so he went down south to Gerar. When the men of the place asked about his wife, he said, "She's my sister," for he was afraid to say, "She is my wife." He thought, "Lest the men of the place kill me for Rebekah. She is beautiful to behold." Now it came to pass, when he had been there a long time, that Abimelech the king of the Philistines looked through a window, and there was Isaac, showing endearment to Rebekah his wife. Then Abimelech called Isaac and said, "Quite obviously, she is your wife, so how could you say she is my sister?" This endearment was being shown in private, but Abimelech the king was a bit of a peeping Tom, looking through the window and spied what was going on in private. The physical relationship that Isaac was expressing towards Rebekah was not the normal affection of a brother and sister, but the endearment of a husband and wife. Paul goes on to say that the wife doesn't have complete authority over her own body. The husband has a say, and likewise the husband doesn't have exclusive authority over his own body, but his wife also has a say, because the two are one, and they must work together in caring for one another and providing for one another. Within a marriage, a husband or wife should not try and manipulate their partner through the use of sex. Do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time. There is a situation where you might abstain from relationships within a marriage for a time, and that is that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, just as you might go without food for some period of time that you might pray, so you might abstain from sexual relationships in marriage for a period of time. But this is done with agreement. You work out together what your plan is. It's interesting that when the children of Israel came before the Lord at Mount Horeb, the instruction was that they were to all have a bath, to cleanse themselves and put on clean clothes, and to abstain from sexual relationships within the marriage until after they had met with God. So there was a sense that they were to give God great honour and deny themselves. It was just for a couple of days, and that kind of thing will still happen within a godly marriage today. But he says, come together again so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. There are many temptations in the world, and these do not come from God, but they come from our own nature, and Satan always puts up his signs to attract, to distract us. And so if we are deficient in self-control, a fruit of the Spirit, we can get caught out. So manage these things carefully. But he's saying, I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. For I wish that all men were even as I myself. Paul himself was not married, and he would be happy if everyone was so devoted to the Lord that they had no time for the marriage situation. But that was not God's plan for society. And so he says, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. In other words, it's not a sin not to marry, but some people are called to singleness. The Lord Jesus himself remained single, but the church is his bride, and so he has kept himself for that future day. And marriage is a picture, as Paul explains in Ephesians, of the relationship between Christ and the church. So, if you are single, that is good. If you are married, that is good. We can't make a rule about these things, but Paul does urge widows and the unmarried, saying it is good if they remain even as I am, that is, if they remain single. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. Again, it comes down to a personal choice. Some women are able to serve God, remaining in singleness. But for the vast majority, evidently, it is good for them to marry. and to serve God in partnership with their husband.